So the final speaker in today's boot camp session on energy systems is Kameshwar Poolla, and he'll talk about the flow of money.
Thank you very much. Great to be here. What a wonderful institute the Simons program is. Okay, so I'm going to give first an overview of electricity markets as they are, and then I'll end with more of what opportunities there might be specific to real-time decision making. So I'll start with a history. So until around 1990, early 1990s, you had the traditional vertically integrated monopoly, where a single entity owned generation, transmission, distribution, and retail. And the reason is because it's expensive to build power systems, and on the transmission side, on the distribution side, it doesn't make sense to have two sets of independently owned wires coming to your house. That redundancy doesn't make sense. And also people perceived that power quality, uninterruptibility in power was so important, we could not sort of let it be left to the whimsy of markets. So, but these monopolies were geographic, sort of regional, and a single entity, as I said, owned all these four functions. And even if you have monopolies, they have to be regulated because, we know that monopolies will extract however much profit they possibly can. Private monopolies would abuse their power, so what we do is we regulate, or what we did was we regulated them in the sense that they receive these monopoly rights in exchange for controls on the retail tariff they impose on their customers. And the Public Utility Commission or some governing body sets these tariffs so that the utility recovers its operational cost, its capital cost, and the utility can pay its investors a fair return on their rate of return. So that's the way it was. And the problem is monopolies are inefficient. So utilities can actually earn more if they invest more. If they make mistakes, these mistakes are simply passed on to the ratepayer. There's no competition, and that's a little bit of a problem. There's, as I said, there's no penalty for poor investment choices. The public picks up all the costs for mistakes. And then what about this business of regulating monopolies? Well, these are 3 to 5 public officials and elected officials, and they may not know a thing about electricity markets. So there's the ignorance problem. Praveen is shaking his head. I shouldn't be actually giving this talk. Everything I know is a strict and small subset of what Praveen has taught me. So just as you all know that. And the other problem with elected officials is they want to get re-elected, so that's a problem. We should also get rid of tenure. So the consequences in this vertically integrated, regulated local monopoly model is that the retail retail electricity tariffs are higher than they should be. It's not very transparent. You just get a bill and you pay it because it's small anyway, relatively. There's systemic waste, and a lot of problems with this. So, 1990s, people said, let's introduce competition, let's deregulate the electricity markets. Let's do this by, in some jurisdictions, some countries, they did this by selling, publicly owned utilities, privatizing them. But in the US, they decided to unbundle the functions of the utility, treat electricity as a commodity, much to Sean's chagrin, and to create markets to trade this commodity. Now, I agree with Sean. I'll come back to that point that it is not really a commodity for very good reasons. The transmission and distribution remain natural local monopolies because you don't want 2 sets of wires. Generators compete against each other, and hopefully this competition will induce wisdom in investment choices, we'll reduce tariffs, all these wonderful things, and we'll also have retail choice. We don't have it everywhere. We have it in the Texas jurisdiction and a few other places. Retail choice isn't quite here. The picture, you see the green states that have largely adopted this deregulated model. The white states are the ones that are not green, are the ones that have stayed with the traditional model. You can also overlay this with an electoral map and see how it correlates. Okay. So the expected benefits and problems with this deregulated model, well, the benefits are that the consumers will pay fairly for what they receive and not for mistakes that utilities have made. There's transparency. You know what you're paying for. Maybe you get a separate line item for distribution charge, for energy charge, for taxes, for things like that. And in the long term, there's the hope that this is a greater efficiency. There are problems, with this deregulated model. One is much greater price volatility in the wholesale market. So this is a picture, in California. I guess I can't see the numbers. 1,000 in Texas. Sean put up some numbers, 3,000. And there's an example from one of Sean's talks where in February 2001, the wholesale price in ERCOT spiked to $3,000 for 3 hours, and generators made a profit of $500 million. That does count towards GDP, I believe, but I don't know how they do that accounting. So, it's not an altogether bad thing for companies to make profits, I guess. Possibly lower reliability, when things are centrally, when you have an integrated monopoly, you can point a finger at somebody, and it's all, the transmission broke or the generation broke. Reliability sort of can be a little bit of an issue. Has the experiment of 20 years or so worked? Opinions are divided. It's kind of complicated. Prices are slightly lower in the deregulated states, but unbundling that lower price is a little difficult because in California we tax the hell out of everything, and I support taxes. Okay, my politics are left, but they are well right of Praveen Varaya. Okay. Is this reduction in price tariffs, again you have to unbundle it, is it because fuel prices have gone down and wind is so cheap? So people have worked hard to justify it, and there are lots of papers. And of course, in this era of alternate facts, you can read the same thing and come to two different conclusions. So I'm going to give you a brief overview of power system operations as they stand today. Again, a very high-level view. Many of the elements here have been talked in more detail, by Stephen Lowe, by Sean. So I'll just give you a little bit. Core problem is balancing supply and demand. That's the problem. But you have to do it economically through markets. You want to do it with transmission constraints. Some lines can only carry so much power. There are thermal limits, things like that. You want to maintain power quality, voltage, frequency. You want to assure reliability against failures of lines, of generations, so you want to have that reliability. And this balancing of supply and demand is managed by a system operator or a transmission, whatever it's called, TSO. And so that's the core problem. And today, I'm going to talk about load, and I'm going to talk about the problem. Today, renewables are modest. We aren't at 50% renewables or something like that. So we talk about net load. Net load is the actual load minus the renewables. So it's really the load left over that has to be serviced by conventional generation. And today, what we do is we adjust the supply to meet the random demand. Okay, that's what we do. We have controllable supply to meet random demand. And tomorrow, when you have much more renewables and when you have maybe loads that are adjustable, like the water heaters that Sean alluded to, like pool pumps that he works on, buildings, then tomorrow the approach, and there's a fair consensus on this, so tomorrow the approach is to tailor the demand to follow the random supply. Okay, we'll come back to that. For now, I'll talk about what goes on now. So again, this is a sort of a stylized model. The actual system operations are complex. They vary tremendously across jurisdictions. As Joe was saying, in England they have a capacity market, I think, and then in Florida they don't have. In Singapore they don't have a day-ahead market. They have a single real-time market. So it varies all over the place, but I'm giving you roughly a common framework. Okay. The idea is you construct the supply to meet the random demand and use both feedback and feed forward. So feed forward means you use forecasts of the net load and you construct supply from various sources to meet this forecasted demand. Time goes by, you get a better forecast, and you fine-tune the collection of generation assets you have assembled to meet the net load. Feedback is used sort of in real time or slightly after the fact when you measure something and make a correction. You measure the frequency. A frequency deviation from system frequency of 60 Hertz is an indicator of an imbalance between between supply and demand, and you make these corrections very quickly using AGC and things like that. So there are these two mechanisms. I'm going to largely talk about feed forward, the market mechanism for doing this. So roughly there are two kinds of markets. There's day ahead and there's real time. Day ahead, you buy power in 1 hour blocks to meet a forecast of the net load. Again, that's load minus renewables. In real time, you buy power in 5-minute blocks to using a better forecast. So you sort of trim your positions that you made a day ahead, and then you do that in the real-time market. It's in quotes because in California, for example, the real-time market closes 37.5 minutes before delivery. Okay, so it's not real-time as we understand. And then after the fact, using feedback, you have regulation for very fine imbalances based on measurement of frequency and things like that. And these are, you might have to pay for capacity for regulation services in addition to energy. And this balancing is done in various time scales. Some assets can do balancing for maybe 5 minutes and they have to hand it off to other assets in case there's a serious dip in frequency and so on. Yes?
So if you overbuy in the day ahead,
yes.
can you resell?
Yes, you do.
Real time.
Yeah, you can take positive and negative positions. Yes.
Are these lengths of time associated with the physical systems, or are these conveniences for traders?
The physical system hasn't really kicked in until time 0. We're talking about 1 day in advance and 37 minutes in advance, and so this is just the way it's evolved.
So there's nothing seasonal here?
No. Okay. So I have some nice pictures, which took me forever to put together in LaTeX. So here we go. The black curve is the day-ahead forecast, and in 1 hour blocks, because of my limitation, I stopped at a 4-hour day. You buy 1 hour blocks in the day-ahead market. And then you get a better forecast. So the black line before became a more nuanced black line. So you have a better forecast, 1 hour in advance, let's say. And now you fill these, so then you have a different imbalance. That's, you've already taken a position. What's left over is the red curve. And you buy these 5-minute blocks in the real-time market. The day-ahead market, also called the wholesale or bulk power market, really carries 90% of the volume or more. And the real-time, also called the balancing market, is much less, 10% or so. Okay? And then even after that, you're done with the market story. There's still fine imbalances of supply and demand. And then this is done using regulation. And you buy like a capacity, for example, for regulation services to deal with that thing, and it's done in various timescales, sub 4 second. It's done completely automatically, and the generators have something called governor control, which is disappearing because governors aren't being compensated for that, so that's going out of the picture. And now this AGC thing, 4 seconds, as Sean was talking about, so that's what goes on. And that's centralized governor, that generation responds to system operator commands. SO stands for system operator, the person who is charged with balancing supply and demand. So that's my sort of summary. Now let's talk about the markets behind day ahead and real time here. So first I want to talk to you about pools and bilateral trading. So the sellers I'm going to talk about are generating companies, people who own coal plants, nuclear plants, combined cycle gas turbines, whatever. And the buyers are utility companies. They're also called load-serving entities. They buy energy or power in the wholesale market and resell it to residential customers, small industrial consumers, commercial, and then the big guys like Google can participate directly in the wholesale market, bypassing the load-serving entities. So many jurisdictions use long-term bilateral contracts. And so these are decentralized, so these are private arrangements between two parties, a buyer and a seller. And the price information is private. They could also be short-term in an OTC or over-the-counter market. What that simply means is, you see, these long-term bilateral contracts take a long time to negotiate. They just take a while you have to worry about all the terms, what if they miss a target, and so on. Whereas in the OTC market, they standardize the product, making it much easier to trade in a standardized product. And then even below that, there are electronic exchanges to sort of make this even simpler. So the system operator doesn't know anything about the prices. All they have to be told about is the volume of the power exchange, between whom, where are they, so that they can assure system reliability, worry about transmission constraints, and so on. So these bilateral contracts are unsuitable for this real-time market, because you can't leave this the eventual balance of supply and demand up to the whimsy of the market, though this is changing with electronic trading and so on. So the real-time market is typically not a bilateral arrangement between buyers and sellers. Renewables today, most of them are simply traded in long-term bilateral contracts, or what are called power purchase agreements. Okay? And the purchase price is a good indicator of the actual cost of renewables. If people are willing to pay that, that's sort of the cost of renewables. Now, our focus is on these things called pool markets, which is very different than a bilateral transactional contract between, say, Praveen and myself. Here, it's centralized. These are decentralized. Here, generators submit bids, price and quantity. I'm willing to sell you this much at this price. The system operator and I forgot to tell you, the load-serving entities or utilities might submit demand bids. I think they're not called bids, but anyway. So that is, we're willing to buy this much at this price, but demand is largely inelastic. Okay, so let's even take that off the table. Let's just generators submit price and quantity bids. The system operator determines the dispatch. This means which generators will generate electricity, how much, and so on. That's what the system operator does in an organized pool market. The system operator also determines the prices. It's the market maker. It clears the market. And sometimes you have a mix of bilateral and pool markets. That's fine. You can put those in there too. And basically the bilateral people participate and accept these prices, but then they hedge against them using other things like prices by contracts for differences and so on. But you can mix the two, okay? But let's keep it clean. Bilateral, pool. Okay. So how are pool markets cleared by the system operator? Let's assume for now there are no transmission constraints, no losses. So it's just like, I have a perfect electricity grid. You have all these generating companies, and then you have inelastic load. So which generations do you pick? Well, the generators submit these supply offers, price and quantity, constraints, minimum generation, maximum generation, maybe even duration. I must run for 5 hours, things like that. And the load-serving entity also submits a demand bid based on forecasts. It's inelastic, so let's say it's just a quantity. Okay? The system operator constructs what's called a merit order stack. So it just organizes generators from cheapest to most expensive, looks at the demand, draws a line, and says, that's the price. Okay, I'll show you a picture next time, so the next slide. So the generators receive this clearing price, uniform clearing price. All generators receive that same price. It's not pay as bid. So if a nuclear plant bid, say, $2 a megawatt hour, but the clearing price is 20, they receive 20. Okay? Not pay as bid. Why do we don't do pay as bid and we just give a uniform price to all the participants? Because this sends the right investment signal. An efficient generator will make a larger profit. And so we're rewarding efficiency. We're making that a good thing to have, and so people will try to become more efficient in the long term. That's the motivation for pay as bid. Okay? The result is efficient, and from just elementary theory of the firm, it maximizes social welfare under truthful bidding. By the way, these bids can be strategic. You don't have to actually bid. The generators don't have to bid their true costs. They just submit bids. Nobody's checking, well, is that really how much it costs for you to make electricity? So it's a strategic bid. Okay, so here's the merit ordering. You have all these generators, and then you stack them up from the least expensive to the most expensive. And here I had like loads bidding different amounts, but really the load is just a vertical line. You intersect, you get the price. And then those generators below the price, that's called the marginal price or whatever, the ones below are those are the ones that are called on to produce electricity, and the ones above, tough luck. Okay? So that's how it goes. The network case is much more interesting. So again, we have load L and generation G. And we model, say, the generation costs, maybe submitted to the system operator. Again, they can be strategic. They can be linear, or they are linear, piecewise linear. I think California you're allowed to submit 9 points. Okay? So let's assume they're convex fuel costs, a minimum and a maximum. So you have this set of inequality constraints. The load is given. It's inelastic, so it's given. We have the DC power flow model that Stephen talked about. And what it says is there are these bus angles times a matrix. The admittance matrix is the net injection G minus L at each bus. Okay? Then you have line capacity constraints, some matrix times theta less than or equal to some given set of vectors. The social cost is the sum of the costs of all the generators. So the problem data are a bunch of matrices and vectors and cost functions. These can be usually piecewise linear. And the decision variables are G and theta. Okay, so there are two problems. One is called economic dispatch. I'm given a set of generators I will use, a set of committed generators. What are the generation levels to meet a given load at minimum cost? That's the problem of economic dispatch. And it's a linear or a convex program. It can be included to sort of full nonlinear power flow models that Stephen alluded to, but then the problem is not a linear program or a convex program. And the output of this economic dispatch is to tell me the generator levels, how much each committed generator should produce, and what the system clearing price is. Okay? I said prices because in the network case, the prices are different at different locations. Okay, unit commitment is a problem that sits above economic dispatch, and it asks to know which generators should I use. Okay, so in this case, you add these binary decision variables alpha, 0 or 1, which generators you use. You run economic dispatch, you solve the problem, find the cost, go back. So really, what you have is a mixed integer program, much harder. Okay, so these are the problems that people study, and I'll focus on economic dispatch because it's a nice, clean problem. So the simplified timeline again is that the generators submit bid curves. Loads submit demand forecasts in 1 hour blocks if I'm talking about the day ahead markets, very similar for the real time. The system operator determines the economic dispatch, how much each generator should produce, and the clearing price at each bus called the locational marginal price. And the loads are obligated to purchase power at that price, and the generators are obligated to supply this generation that is specified by the system operator and receive the locational marginal price, the price at the node at which they are injecting power. Then you proceed to the real-time market. There are lots of important details I've omitted, which I'll maybe come back to later. All participants at bus I face a price lambda I regardless of their bids. Okay, so the economic dispatch problem is minimize system cost subject to the Kirchhoff's voltage law and Kirchhoff's current law. This is the DC power flow model. Transmission line constraints on the capacity. Minimum generation, maximum generation. Now, if these generation costs are piecewise linear, you can see we have a linear program. The dual variable for this constraint, the power flow constraint, is called the locational marginal price. There's one per bus. The dual variables for the transmission constraints are called the congestion prices. I won't talk much about that. So these locational marginal prices, the interpretation of the dual variable is the price of delivering one extra unit of energy at that bus. If there's no congestion, then all the prices all the locational marginal prices are the same everywhere. Okay? If even one line is congested, say the line over there between nodes 1 and 4 is congested, then the prices at all the other nodes not even connected directly to that bus change. Okay? So what is the payment made to the generators? It's the prices, the vector of prices transpose times the generation quantity that the system operator comes up with, the dispatch. The total payment from the loads is this. Fortunately, the system operator who makes the market never loses money. Okay? The payments received from the loads is always bigger than the payments shelled out to the generators. And that difference is called the merchandising surplus. In part, it is used to support what are called financial transmission rights, but they'll actually make even more money a lot of the time because it's in an auction. But in the long run, merchandising surplus is used to support other things that the system wants to do, like transmission expansion. Okay, this is a very simple example. I have two generators, a cheap and an expensive one. There's no load over here. There's a load over here, 5 units. And there's a transmission line with capacity 10. I would use the cheap generator, and it goes 5 units of power go from here, the cheap generator, along the line to the load, uncongested. The marginal price of supplying one more unit of energy here is pi1, because I can still use the cheap generator. Suppose the line is congested, the load is demanding 15 units of power. You can only get 10 from this cheap generator. So you have to buy 5 from this expensive generator. The locational marginal price is now pi2. So this load pays pi2 for all of its 15 units. Okay? Okay. These LMPs are counterintuitive in flows and in prices. Electricity is not like wheat or roses. We would not ship roses from San Francisco to Anchorage. They're grown here, I think. Okay, and it would cost more. We would not, whichever, you got. Yeah, okay. So electricity cannot be stored, it can be stored in batteries, but not in large quantities at reasonable cost, okay? So these LMPs could be, firstly, they can be negative, as Sean showed in his thing. They can exceed the marginal cost of any one generator, or even the most expensive generator. They can be all over the map. And then there's the Bray's paradox, which is if you think, I'm going to invest in a transmission line, make it higher capacity, that should relieve congestion and reduce costs, not necessarily. Okay? Yes, if you make the cost, if you make that all transmission lines infinitely big, then yes. But a small amount of strengthening can increase prices. Okay? So that's called the Bray's paradox. One more thing here. this expensive generator has, what is the word, I'm jet lagged, market power over this load here. Okay, because it sets the marginal price for this guy. It can say, you know, when it bids, it can say, oh no, it's $200, sorry, you're out of luck. In which case, this poor load over here has to pay $200. So there's market power that generators can exert over loads. This example is too simple. In a big network case, a generator in location at bus A can exert market power on loads that are remote in some other buses, not connected with a direct link. You know, maybe even all the lines emanating from this bus, from this generator, are not congested, can still exert market power at remote buses. So market power is a very interesting topic. And then the last thing I want to tell you about is band-aids and what's going on today. Electricity markets are balkanized, okay? They're in practice. So there are many extra market payments. You know, we have to worry about startup costs and shutdown costs, about no-load costs. What if this generator was not scheduled, it's still burning fuel? Yeah, so there are a bunch of make-whole payments, okay? It's a little murky sometimes how that's done. So the minute you have, you know, side payments, it's called like extra market. It's not being done in some transparent way. There's subsidies, preferential treatments. We're now about to see a huge preferential treatment for coal-fired plants, I think. There are production credits, you know, all sorts of things. There are attempts to retain very important participants, to assure sort of liquidity. There are all these things that balkanize the market. And these things increase inefficiencies because we're now stepping away from, you know, a clean competitive marketplace. But the economic orthodoxy, and I do wish Borenstein were here, you know, he says, you know, spot markets, real-time pricing is the only thing you need. You know, I disagree with him, maybe a little more modestly than other folks. One argument that people say, oh, real-time pricing, consumers, you know, you don't want to deal with all this volatility. But no, but then sure, there'll be other companies, there'll be insurance companies that come and take away the volatility risk at a price. So that's fine. But the real-time pricing, our objection doesn't come from that aspect, from the volatility aspect, but more from that there are different commodities, and we'll talk about that in a second. Okay. Retail tariffs, that's in the end. The smaller consumers, what do they pay? That's what a tariff is. And as I said, the larger participants participate directly in the wholesale market, and the smaller ones have to buy from the utility. It's reselling. And these retail tariffs have been generally fixed. They're set. They don't, you know, it isn't like you wake up in the morning and guess how much a kilowatt hour of electricity costs. It's pretty much set. And as I said, the economic orthodoxy is real-time pricing. That's where people want to get towards. And people are sort of creeping towards that. Right now you have volumetric or tiered pricing. So for the first 20 units of electricity, you pay this much. For the next 20 units, you pay a higher rate, and so on and so forth, to sort of discourage you from wasting electricity. You have time of use pricing, which is like during times when electricity is scarce and expensive, the price is more. Okay, again, trying to approximate real-time price. In California, this is already here. Time of use price is available. It's opt-in, but in a year or two, it's going to be opt-out. So the default will be time of use price. And then industrial consumers pay. I don't think residential consumers are faced with critical peak pricing, but that's in addition to your payment for energy. They calculate your monthly peak, and you pay for the peak. So they want to try and make your usage not peaky, but as flat as possible. For industrial consumers, the peak price, the critical peak price, can be comparable to the energy price paid on a monthly basis. So much for. Oh, there are other markets that I won't talk to you about. Markets for inertia, capacity, transmission expansion, transmission rights, virtual grids. I won't talk to you about all of these because I kind of want to focus on real-time decision making, which is the apparent theme of our group here. Okay, that's my sort of status quo summary. I have till 5 o'clock, right? Yeah, okay. Okay, so things fall apart. So utilities have had this was long ago, so now things have gotten better. Utilities are in trouble. The European utilities have lost a lot of money. The problem is more serious in Europe than it is in the United States, because we print money. That's no problem. It's partly because, and I'll tell you why. It's because of the embrace of renewables. Okay, Germany has embarked on a really profound and applaudable experiment to bring in so much renewables, so much, and they're rewarding the people who do this. Pig farmers in Munich are stopping producing pigs, and it's more lucrative for them to sell energy, because the price of sausages apparently has skyrocketed. Okay, solar prices are falling, modulo the recent import tariff that Trump has announced. There are lots of troubling facts. I won't read through them. But utilities are convinced that their business model is under threat, and they're losing money. Okay? And it's because of renewables. Okay? And so why is this crisis driven by renewables? So this is the situation now. You have the load in black, and then you have this something called base load. So that's like a nuclear plants or a big coal plant. They just must run. Okay? And so they bid zero, so they're going to run because it's too expensive for them to turn on and off their generation. And then what's left over is the market, like this day-ahead market, wholesale market I alluded to. And then, there's volatility even in a single day of the load, or even in a single hour. And you have reserves. So there's a little bit of reserves. You need a different kind of generation. You need a fast-acting generation, a gas-fired plant typically for that. So that's the picture today. Now you throw in renewables, which say cycle. Let's say they're solar, so up and down, up and down. Let's say you have a lot of renewables. They are also must run because their marginal cost is zero. So you take them. Okay? And when you do that, the base load again is free. Must run, it's here. The market drops to 25%. 25. So so this is where the utilities are right now. They're bidding into the day-ahead market with their plants, and that's why they're losing money. This is an exaggerated cartoon, but that's why they're losing money. Also notice that these fast-acting plants, you need a lot more of the reserves because renewables are up and down. And moreover, you only need them for like half the time or 1/3 of the time. So the capacity factor is small. So I do agree that these fast-acting gas-fired turbines that provide reserves in an era of lots of renewables, they worry about not being compensated adequately. Okay? Because, yes, there's a lot of them, but they only run 1/3 of the time. Okay? So would I invest in it? I need some guarantee of rate of return. So perhaps a capacity market for reserves is the right thing. I don't know. Where am I here? Okay. So it's all this renewables and variability. And as I said, there are other problems like wind ramps and things like that, and need for more regulation in of various kinds. The people say that you're going to need 3 times more reserves and all sorts of things like that. The bottom line is, people are now saying, look, let's try to tailor demand to meet random supply, as opposed to tailor supply to meet random demand. So a paradigm shift. So addressing this crisis, there are all sorts of new business models that utilities are exploring. Whether it's leasing your rooftop, putting their own renewables, basically getting into the renewables themselves, owning that production so they're not completely displaced from the market segment. And offering information services, knowing, just metering, knowing your customer, all sorts of things like that. They're trying to reduce operational expenses, again, using information technology, and so on. Okay, let me leave it at that. So finally, a critique of the legacy markets that I described, the day ahead, the pool, the bilateral, the two settlement markets, is that they were designed for slow-acting conventional generation. They were designed in an era of coal-fired plants, of nuclear plants, perhaps. That's why day ahead. That's where that came from. One day, I need to generate all that steam. It's going to take me a while. And that's where that came from. They need lead time. And also, why 1 hour? Well, these big things, these big generation, they can't change on a dime. Okay, so that's where these things came from. Also, the flow of information is just top down. It's just, they, except in the last bit to measure frequency and make a trim, it's all this way. The new opportunities, new problems. So a lot more renewables. Some parts of load, like water heaters, pool pumps, are controllable. There's demand response. There are new sensing assets, micro PMUs. There's all sorts of, there's smart meters everywhere. There are new power electronics devices that can do miraculous things, of which I know very little. So there's a lot of activity in this. And all of these things suggest maybe we need new market ideas. That's what I'll talk to you about. I'll talk to you about 9 possible new market things. Well, not all of these have come to pass, but I'm going to put them out there. Okay? And these are the ones I chose are because they're connected to real-time decision making, most by and large. So let's start with renewables. You all know that renewables are intermittent and random and uncontrollable. I just want to put up the plot of solar power, 1 day in Arizona at 10-second sampling, 1 month in the Nordic grid, and 1 hour sampling. The spectral nature of this randomness is really quite different. Okay? So you might, for example, have a small amount of storage to smooth out passing clouds and things like that. You don't need much, okay? But it must be relatively fast acting, so you could do stuff like that. And here in the Nordic grid, there's a period of 1 week where the wind simply blows at 20% of nameplate of the grid. So then you have to really find other assets. Okay. So the spectral nature of renewables is not monolithic. It varies by source, by asset, by where it is. Okay. And yes, some amount of geographic aggregation will relieve you of this the variability. But if it's blowing, it's windy here, and all the wind farms are on the coast. Well, it's windy up and down the coast. So there's some degree you can't completely count on it being washed out. How are renewables sold today? Renewables can't participate in day-ahead markets. Why? Because you have to commit to 1 hour blocks. Day ahead, your day-ahead forecast errors for renewables are 25% maybe. Renewables are not firm, not flat. Firm means constant. In 1 hour blocks, there's no renewable source with that sort of profile. You could participate in the real-time market because 30 minutes ahead, you have a 3 or 2% forecast error. And the technique is just the very simple, what's it called? The previous one. The forecasting method for renewables is to use the previous value. Persistence, thank you. It's certainly you can make it. If it's not firm on 5-minute blocks, you can use a modest amount of storage to make it firm on 5-minute blocks. The volume in the real-time market is very small. So if you imagine, I'm going to have 30-40% of my total energy being provided by renewables, then that doesn't quite work. Okay, so the wind today is mostly sold, and even transmission scale solar is sold through bilateral contracts or power purchase agreements, as I said earlier. Small residential PV is sold through net metering. Net metering is a program where the meter runs backward in your home. You have solar, you make more than you're using, your meter runs backward. Okay. It's a perverse sort of program. It's like you have a garden at home and you're selling carrots, and there's carrots. You have too many carrots because your daughter doesn't like carrots. So you go down to Safeway and say, oh, how much are you selling carrots for? Okay, it's $1.20 a pound. Here are all these carrots, and Safeway is obligated to buy these carrots. Okay? It doesn't make sense. Okay? Utilities hate it. Safeway hates this program. So it's under severe threat. Arizona, Hawaii, so that's going to put a big clamp on residential solar PV investment. Okay. What about the future? How can we sell random renewables? Well, you could bundle with storage, so you have storage to make the renewables firm. Okay, that's a real-time decision-making problem. So when do I charge the storage? When do I discharge storage? You could aggregate with other renewable sources or sharing. Okay, and Pratyush works on stuff like that to take into account statistical diversity. Where do you put the storage? How do you send the command? Should I forecast the renewables? There's a control and a decision-making problem if you wish to firm renewables so they can participate in the day-ahead wholesale market. Okay, next. And another thing one could do is completely rethink the product. Let's not think of energy as some, electricity as some undifferentiated thing, but a differentiated commodity. So, for example, there's a really interesting, lovely paper by Tan and Varaya, where you differentiate electricity based on reliability. So, for example, I'll sell you, 10 kilowatt hours of electricity with probably 0.99. You pay a lot. I'll sell you 10 kilowatts of electricity, same commodity, but with probability 0.5. You may or may not get it, and you should pay less. Okay? That's an interesting product. It's not the same product that you're selling unreliable and reliable. So one can explore how one prices that product, how one constructs supply to meet demand, and you may say, well, how do you audit such a product? Suppose you bought unreliable electricity, which you're supposed to get with chance 0.95, and how do you know that you're not being screwed, right? This is a question we should all ask ourselves every day since November of last year. Okay? Well, you can do long-term auditing and count on fundamental theorems in probability to say that in the law of large numbers I should get. Okay. Another differentiated product is deadline differentiated, where you can say there are two kinds of gasoline. That's what I mean by product differentiation. Okay, unleaded, super unleaded. So in deadline differentiated, which Stephen Lowe, Elian Bitar, you will receive a product of so many hours, kilowatt hours of electricity, but for the next hour, for the next 2 hours, 3 hours. And if you want that firm power for longer and longer, maybe you have to, did I get this wrong? The price should be higher.
Notice they get longer to provide the same.
Oh, I see. That's another way. Okay, is that what they meant by this, Stephen? That okay, that's okay. Thank you, Joe. By the way, there are a lot of people here who know way more than I do. Okay, let me point out some of them: Stephen Lowe, Sean Main, Pratyush, Joe Warrington, Praveen Varaya. Okay, so if you have questions, please, talk to them. Duration differentiated contracts. So here's a random power supply. Let's sell slices of power. What do you notice about this slice? It's on sometimes, off sometimes, on sometimes, off sometimes. Okay? So that's another product differentiation, rethinking the product. The problem with this sort of thing is consumers have to plan their consumption. Okay? Well, are you going to tell me when I'm going to get the thing? How much in advance? Things like that. So let me show you a little picture which will connect us to real-time decision making. Suppose the time is slotted and I could only draw 4 time slots in my thing, okay, instead of 24. 1 hour slots. And there are a bunch of customers. And different customers demand different unit amounts of energy. But they're indifferent to which blocks they receive that energy. For example, this customer 1 wants 1 unit of energy for 1 hour. You could give it to him here, or here, or here, or here. This other customer wants 2 units of energy. So there's the 2. You could supply it here, or maybe those 2, or any 2 of the 4. Whereas this fifth customer needs 4 units of energy in 4 time slots. So really, they're not offering you any flexibility. You simply have to provide energy in every one of those time slots. Another example of product differentiation. But now you have a lot of questions. If the supply is known, when is it adequate to service this given collection of consumers? If it's adequate, what is the allocation? If it's not, you may need to purchase extra power. What is the minimum purchase? What is the purchase policy if the random supply is revealed in runtime? So lots of research problems in controls, in real-time decision making, and policies, and how do you price it? And combined with economics. Okay, so how do you price? How do you price these differentiated products, quantity and H hours delivered for H hours of the 24? Okay, so these are interesting questions. Risk limiting dispatch. So this is concerned with, right now I talked about a day ahead market and a real time market, which is really 30 minutes in advance. Your renewable forecasts day ahead are 30%, 25% uncertainty. Whereas, 30 minutes before, you pretty much know how windy it is or how sunny it is. So this 2 settlement day ahead real-time market structure is a legacy of nuclear and coal-fired plants. It's not favorable to wind and solar. So perhaps we should construct a series of intermediate markets to make digesting of renewables, because of the uncertainty in renewables, more favorable. Okay? So now you have a random load that you wish to meet. This is copied from PowerPoint. That should be L. Okay, and that should, well. And then again, like in the day ahead, you buy a big block, 1 hour block. Next market, you buy a 30-minute block, a 10-minute block, a 5-minute block. So you construct your supply to meet this random demand in a series of markets. But the twist is, you have information about your demand. This is the delivery time. This far away, I have much more uncertainty in my knowledge of the net load. And as I progress, I have more and more information, and I can make better and better decisions. But the key thing is, you make these future decisions aware that you will have a recourse opportunity. Okay? It isn't that you're simply optimizing your purchase in this market at this time. It's optimizing this given that you will have these future opportunities and that you will have statistically this much better forecast information and so on and so forth. So it's a complicated problem. This is called risk limiting dispatch. You can read more about it in this excellent paper. And you can see it's real-time decision making. So I saw this slide in their paper. It says decision, 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 decision. So this is a perfect and real-time. So I thought this was the perfect picture to put up without getting into the details of what they do. Except to say that it is a threshold policy. Okay? Electricity storage. It's very expensive, $300 per kilowatt hour for lithium ion, less, it's $270 something. It's falling fast. It's more if you're going to buy the fancy Tesla batteries, a little bit more than that, 400 or so. It's a game changer at the transmission scale if you can do a lot, if you can put a lot of storage. But before you even get there, there are many distribution side applications like arbitrage against time of use pricing. If I have high and low prices, I charge the battery when it's, and so on. A voltage support, trading between peer firms, that's work by Dilip Kalathil. It's over here. So let's just look at one example. The industrial firm, it faces what are called critical peak prices. Or maybe it faces real-time prices. Critical peak is you pay for a monthly peak. So how do you use your storage to flatten that monthly peak when you don't even see it coming? Okay, so it's a stochastic control problem, a decision problem. The decisions are when to charge, when to discharge storage. Okay? There's uncertainty in price, uncertainty in loads. So it's a very interesting problem. Maybe the policies are very complicated and you're a manufacturer of this integrated storage for companies. You want a simple policy, okay? Because if it doesn't work, you're going to be called to fix it, right? So are there simple suboptimal policies that get you 90% of the way there? There are a lot of interesting problems one can look at. What about transmission scale storage? Again, now I'm talking about big storage. I'm hoping that the price drops to, say, $150, $125 per kilowatt hour of storage. Okay? So there's this mandate in California for 1.3 gigawatts, and as Sean said, that's a unit of power, not energy. And so what they're really talking about here is ramping and other things for the duck curve. They're not talking about what I'm going to tell you about. So the idea for selling transmission scale storage, and this is something that Hamid Reza, who's over there, is looking at, is to essentially follow this day-ahead wholesale, day-ahead economic dispatch sort of formulation. And there you were selling energy in 1 hour blocks. So here's the difference. Utilities, this is the game plan. Utilities install some amount of storage at their various buses, but they don't know when to charge and discharge that storage because they don't know, if you want to do arbitrage, they don't know what the LMPs are going to look like. They can't calculate these LMPs because that requires private information about the bids made by other generation companies, maybe about the transmission line congestion and the loads, and they don't have that information. So rather than guess and try to do arbitrage and charge and discharge your storage to make money, why don't you just throw up your hands and tell the system operator how much storage you have? Submit your demand bid. Now that demand bid is also plus minus the storage amount, right? So the system operator knows that that's your nominal, but they can move, suppose there are 2 time periods, and you have, say, 10 units of storage. You can shift your demand, 10 units of your demand from one time period to the other. So the system operator knows that, and the system operator conducts multi-period economic dispatch and dispatches optimally not just the generation units, but your storage. So you throw up your hands and say, listen, I can't do this arbitrage myself. I don't have access to a lot of private information. Let the system operator decide for me when I should charge and discharge my storage. One can show that the system of the collection of utilities or storage owners, which might be third parties, will benefit. But an individual storage owner at a single bus may not. Okay? Even though they've put up their storage for use by everybody else, they may not benefit. Their locational marginal prices go up, despite their having that storage. Okay? So then one has to rethink, maybe that should be after the fact, exchanges of money to incentivize people to yield their storage. And so the business model for making whole private ownership of storage is an open one, which Hamid will be looking at. The system does benefit, I think. I don't know, you can ask him. So it's still a convex optimization problem because the existence of storage at various buses simply adds a convex constraint to the economic dispatch. Demand response. So Sean was talking, he's done a lot of excellent work on the what hall? I forgot the name of the hall. With the fans. And ProBeer. And so what are flexible loads? Electric vehicles. I'm indifferent to when you recharge my electric vehicle as long as you deliver it when I need it. Okay? When I need it, which you don't know when I need it. I don't know when I need it. So that's a little bit of an issue there. Okay? I put 7 a.m. because it's unlikely any of us wake up before then except maybe Praveen. Yoga. yoga. All the yoga guys need it before. HVAC systems have a thermal deadband. We want 70 degrees plus minus. I don't know what we can't really feel. 2 degrees, I guess. I don't know. 1 degree. And you can use this flexibility to monetize it in many different ways. You can view it as an up and down generation resource. FERC order something 755 elevates demand response to generator status. Generators objected, went to litigation, went to the Supreme Court. Finally, it was approved. What's this beeping? And then, so yes, now you can, of course, now it could be reversed. Who knows? A simple use of demand response is peak shaving. At these times when electricity is scarce and expensive, you can cajole people, pay them, threaten them to reduce their demand. Okay? And these peak prices of electricity can be very, very high. And I think Texas has a maximum of 9,000. Okay? I think in Australia they don't even have a peak. They don't have a cap. Someplace they don't. Used to? No. Then there's frequency regulation, which is what Sean was doing. There are so many uses of demand response. I lump it all in one thing. It can be event-driven. It can be continuously providing some service, like a backup. That's what contingency reserves are. And there are two architectures. There's direct load control, where you just cede control of your appliance or your factory within certain limits. For example, industrial air conditioner, just say, listen, you guys run it. Except, here's my temperature constraint. Direct load control. Okay? That's used, for example, in refrigeration warehouses, direct load control. Okay? Indirect load control is where these devices are controlled through price proxies. You nudge people to, say, not use an appliance or to use an appliance by modulating the price of electricity. Okay, that's what it is. But let's start with how do you model demand response. Modeling an individual household, my consumption of electricity in my flexible dishwasher is hopeless. Okay, but in an aggregate, there will be some predictability, which you need if you're going to offer this in a market. If you're going to offer this demand response as a generator in some market, providing some ancillary service, maybe a capacity market, or in the real-time market, providing balancing. You need some predictability. And it's hopeless to do it for one electric vehicle when you have arrival rates and departure rates and states of charge that are unknown. Yes, you can say they're Poisson and move on from there. But not having met Poisson, I don't know, I'm skeptical. But one can model things conservatively. So you take all this flexibility and say, I'm going to assure that it's at least like a battery. I'm going to leave something on the table. So the degree of flexibility, which is really a set of acceptable power profiles for this collection of appliances owned in aggregate by a community of individuals, that collection of admissible power profiles contains the power profiles that a battery can give you. A battery with capacity C and maximum charge and discharge rate M. And one can do this. Yes, you leave something on the table. Off is something on or off on the table. I don't know which it is. But these battery parameters, capacity and ramp rate, depend on exogenous random processes. Take a building. Okay, let's take a residential air conditioner. Let's say the exogenous temperature is 90 degrees. You really don't have much flex in the duty cycle of the operation of that thing. Is going to hum all the time. Okay? So when it's very hot, there's hardly any flexibility from your residential air conditioner. What about when it's very cold? Well, you don't even turn the damn thing on. So you have your battery capacity depends on exogenous things. Occupancy, are you even at home? Okay? On temperature, things like this. So what I'm trying to tell you is that all these buildings, all of which have thermal inertia and can cede this flexibility, can sell this flexibility as a resource to the electric grid and make some modest amounts of money in exchange, you should look at all of these buildings as batteries. Except that these batteries are random. So you have to do some degree of forecasting of some exogenous process, whether it's occupancy or weather. So you need lead time. You need lead time. You know, if you're going to try and do this a month in advance, it's going to be a little hopeless. So maybe a day lead time is not right either. So maybe these intermediate markets in risk limiting dispatch are important, okay, to sell demand response. So selling demand response capability. As I said, it's different than generation. It's virtual random batteries. There's much greater uncertainty in their delivery. You need a lead time, maybe 4 hours. I don't know, I'm guessing. It's not stationary. It's not the same battery every day. You have to forecast some exogenous processes. And maybe you sell demand response capacity in a forward market. That's one choice. Maybe you sell options, and this is something that Senli and Dilip are looking at. So like a regular option, sold at a certain time, and what you're selling is the right to use my battery for 1 hour starting at some future time. And there's a strike price you pay per unit, say maybe per unit of capacity. And there's an energy use price in case you decide to exercise the option. Okay? And the option must be exercised by some expiration date, so I can then maybe, if you don't want to buy it, I can sell it to something else. You know, what are the natural market prices? Not just in this context, but how much should we pay for demand response? Okay, in a market setting. Or even forget a market, how expensive really, if I say demand response is like generation, how expensive is it? Is it like $10 a megawatt hour? $5 a megawatt, $2 a megawatt hour? You know, we have to sort of understand this. And all this stuff, then there's all sorts of other things one can ask, which come from the theory of market equilibria. So, you know, how efficient is this? How does this compare with the gold standard, which is the Dibrow-Arrow sort of market model there? Okay, keep going. Oops. Ah, that was the beeping. Dead battery. Now it's totally dead. Okay, so another thought is capacity markets for balancing. This real-time market, it's still a market. Well, why not just, like you have the regulation market capacity for that, why don't we do the real-time balancing as a capacity? So here's the idea, again, balancing supply and demand, maybe in a 1 hour window, 5-minute time slots. And instead of taking a statistical approach, we'll take a deterministic approach. The idea is you have diverse controllable assets that can remove uncertainty, okay? And then there are like generation, like storage, like demand response. So there's some assets whose output you can control. And you can buy these assets, and they're diverse. And you have other agents that add uncertainty in the system. You don't know how much energy they're going to use, like loads, like renewables. Two sets of agents. Agents that add uncertainty, agents that remove uncertainty. Okay? And by uncertainty, I'm talking about in the balancing market. So the bulk power, if you're going to consume 5 plus minus 1 kilowatt hour, that 5 has been taken care of in the day-ahead market. Now we're just talking about the plus minus 1. Okay? Here's the setup. I've divided this 1 hour block into T 5 minutes, so 5, 1, 6, 12 time slots. So uncontrollable resource I injects an imbalanced signal EI. I don't know it. I model it deterministically as belonging to this convex set EI. If you sum all these imbalanced signals, you get the signal E. That is the total imbalanced signal injected by all the uncontrollable agents. It must be dealt with. I've modeled it deterministically. Each EI lives in this set. So E, which is the sum of these signals, lies in that set. That is a Minkowski sum of these convex sets. Now, how do I balance this unknown signal in this set E? I have to purchase in a forward market the capacity to do so. I can purchase resource K, and if I buy 1 unit of resource K, imagine a battery. If I buy 1 battery, it gives me the right to supply any power signal in this set S. If I buy 2 units of that battery, I get 2S. Or 2.3 units, I get 2.3S. Each unit of this resource, controllable resource K, costs pi K. QK is a purchase decision of how much of this resource I buy. Then, here's the problem. E is the imbalance signal set. I have to cover it. I have to balance the uncertainty. QK is the amount of resource K I buy. Resource K, unit amount of resource K provides that much of my signal. So that's the total thing I've purchased. Okay, the controllable assets that I purchase can generate any signal in this convex set. It must contain the imbalance set. And I'm buying QK resources at price pi K, so that's my total cost. Here's the problem. Minimize over the decision variables QK, that subject to this set containment problem. It's a convex. So you kind of grow these convex sets until they cover the imbalance set E. It is a linear program. If you assume that these are vertex polytopes or convex hull of vertex. Okay, not specified by half planes, not intersections. If they're vertex polytopes. If they're half planes, then it's a hairy problem. So we can do this. So we can solve this. It's a linear program, for crying out loud. We can solve this. But there's something funny here. When we solve this problem, what we're doing is, if you are given an imbalanced signal in this set, we are guaranteeing that we can allocate controllable assets, say RK, so that I balance that signal. But that signal is not revealed all at once. This imbalanced signal is revealed in runtime. So this J star is the optimal resource procurement under Oracle information. Okay, I don't know how much uncertainty I'm going to get, minute to minute. So if you want, under causal allocation of resources, you have to add essentially a causality constraint. And that gives me this, say, J double star. Okay? And this is something Joe Warrington, so it's related very closely to what Joe did in his thesis. You can compute this optimal resource procurement cost under causal allocation, but for a restricted class of policies, maybe proportional, maybe linear time varying, and so on. It reduces to collections in my formulation, or collections of linear programs. Okay? Then you can introduce this thing called the cost of causality. But what did I say? You can compute upper bounds of the cost. You can't compute that exactly because you don't know what, you don't have an exhaustive parameterization of causal policies. That ratio, we call it the cost of causality. It tells you how important it is that this imbalanced signal be revealed in runtime, or the importance of good forecasts of that imbalance. And we can actually compute this exactly in various cases of practical interest. For the particular problem of balancing in real-time markets, it turns out that this thing is very, very close to 1, okay, for a particular reason which Akhil and Lisen are working on. So I'll leave it at that. That was problem number 9. And this is problem number 10, sorry. So here is where a lot of real-time decision making is taking place. There are commercial products out there that, home energy management, you have storage, you have PV, you have a smart appliance, you have all this stuff. And you have to control it. You have uncertainty in when you need these appliances, uncertainty in prices. And this doesn't have to be a home, it can be an industrial thing. But people are trying to commercial. I'm sure Honeywell and whoever does these things is sort of getting involved in this. And my home is not smart. The occupants of my home aren't that smart either. But we'll deal with that. Okay. So there are many opportunities, in my view, for real-time decision making. But and I've given you all these sort of these problems, how do they sort of fit? What is the larger rubric, at least as we imagine it? Okay, we being our substantially big research group here. So we call it Grid 2050 because I will not be here in case it doesn't work out this way. 40% renewables, more, who knows? Another interesting thing that we're trying to, that Donya and Hamid are looking at. So all these renewable portfolio standards is in California. So we want 40% renewables and some other place. And they're now starting to specify the second digit, 32.6% renewables by 2030. Where are these numbers coming? They're just pulled out of, what will the public accept? What looks good in marketing? Is there some mathematical, thing given forecasts of fuel price? And we think there is. And we're trying to ask these questions. Okay? How do you set renewable portfolios? So what we see in the future is lots of renewables. And if you have a lot more renewables, distributed renewables, that delays the need for, say, investing more in transmission planning, which is expensive because you have to displace people. You need right of way, or what it's called, eminent domain. Is that what it's called? So this is the legacy grid. This is the transmission line drawn thick, transmission line tomorrow drawn thin. You don't need it as much. And instead you have generation assets, more power is generated and consumed locally. And the whole sort of distribution side is grouped into what might be called clusters or microgrids that are managed. Okay? And so that's what maybe they provide local power balance. Maybe they exchange energy between each other through a market. How does a market for interconnected microgrids look like? Who assures reliability? Who is to blame? Are we paying too much for reliability anyway? So lots of interesting questions of that nature. So, I guess we need a grid operating system. That's really, what I'm suggesting. Because there's so many different kinds of resources. We need some standardization, like OpenADR for demand response. And we need, software tools to we need to work with those guys and the other. Okay, I won't say anything more. How big should these clusters be? Surely a home is not big enough. We need some sort of aggregation. I can't be responsible for power balance or firming. How big must they be? What do I need? Diversity, statistical diversity? Don't know. What are performance metrics for this architecture? So some of the things we might need, as I said, power quality, reliability, very important. You can imagine within the cluster, if it's, say, 5,000 homes, there are millions of microtransactions. I might sell my rooftop solar energy in 1-2 minute chunks to somebody else. Small transactions, sub-cent. Okay? How do you manage that? What does a market look? What does the hardware look like? So there are these companies that are doing really extraordinary things, like virtual power systems. I hope to get them to our seminar series here, some of the industrial people. So you need a radically new market structure to support millions of small and diverse transactions. The key word is diverse. Because if I'm selling, say, excess solar in 2-3 minute blocks, I have some constraints. I have some uncertainty. If I'm selling, and I want to include, say, a conventional generator, selling that, maybe I have a minimum runtime. If I'm selling DR, I have a lead time. You have these diverse constraints. And can we manage them in some clearing place? And so we're thinking about this. We call it APEX, Automated Power Exchange. And Junji Quinn, who's also going to do this. Ram Rajagopal at Stanford. And the key idea is to maybe come up with an atomic set of commodities that one transacts. A small list, 5-6 things. And your particular constraints can be translated into combinations of these atomic sets of assets. So I might be willing to sell 2 of these and 3 of these and 4 of these because of the constraints I have in producing my asset. Okay? And then these are not bilateral transactions, but multilateral transactions. They're not spot market, but coupled spot markets. So you have an order book where there are prices and quantities for these composed commodities, and these are coupled in this order book. How do you clear these? First come, first serve. How do you clear these multilateral transactions? So this is, something to worry about. What are metrics for this marketplace? How, is it like bid-ask spread, transaction, average daily volume, things like this. We're trying to simulate this. Jonathan Mather, Junji Ram Rajagopal is fantastic at Stanford. And this is sort of really what PNNL calls transactional energy. That's where we're going. So there's collections of microgrids, a distributed, leaderless market to clear it. That's blockchain. But then blockchain isn't going to support the throughput, at least not now, the kind of throughput that we might need for this. But then we don't need the same security that blockchain assures because it's a microsynth, so what do we need? There are many other problems, and there are many fantastic creative researchers working on many of these problems. Shmuel Oren, who's right here, is a resource. There's so much about market power, about competition models. He does these mixed Cournot and what was the other one? Bertrand, Cournot Bertrand. Thank you very much. As I said, everything I know is a strict subset of everything. Okay. Then Abhishek has worked on Virtual Bridge with Rahul Jain. They're both here. So it's almost unclear to me why we needed a boot camp on electricity. Sharing, Dilip is here. Josh Taylor isn't here. Elian Bitar will be here in March, hopefully. He's worked on very interesting things on financial storage rights. Leche, I think we'd love to hear on his coupon. Leche is not here. It's right there. The coupon experiment, that would be really nice to hear. Data analytics, again, Leche has done a fair bit of work on that. And he's really organizing at NSF something on big data in energy, which you can tell us more about. Gaming, so DR is very susceptible to gaming because there's no natural baseline. It's a counterfactual, so there's work on that. With Dilip Muthira and Pratyush, a lot of great stuff out there. There's a chill political wind. Let me not make things rosier than they sound. But you know what I mean. Electricity market innovation is largely driven by renewables, which in turn are inspired by the desire to make our air breathable for generations, our planet habitable for generations. It's also driven by innovations in electronics and sensing and storage, but it's really climate change, renewables. Okay? Because if you just had coal-fired plants, our market structure now is fine. Some recent news: PV panel tariff 30%. That's been added, or is it 40%? I don't know what it is, to Chinese imports of PV. They're really good at making it. They make it cheap. And then, by the way, when you do that, you lose 15,000 solar installation jobs. You're much higher paying. So there's that. FERC is being pushed to subsidize, to bail out coal because they offer a resilience subsidy. That's what it's being called. They initially opposed the thing January 8th, but now they've been forced to reopen it, and they're going to come to some middle ground. It might not be 10 billion, but something. You are paying for that resilience subsidy of coal. But I sort of remain at least a long-term optimist, because, there are many smart people out there somewhere. There are recourse opportunities called elections, and so that's what I wanted to say. But today at Davos, Rick Perry promotes coal, U.S. coal exports as we are exporting freedom. So get this, you buy coal, you're free. Except you're bound to buy that coal because you built these coal-fired plants. The only way you're free is if you're buying renewables, because the sun will truly liberate you, or the wind, right? So I have a very incomplete list of references, which I'll add to and I'll make available to the group. Thank you.
Question?
I mean, so, I was so excited when FERC 755 came out, and that's the one where they recognized that there was value for services from batteries. So there was a service, performance requirement, and then they paid for mileage. So basically, it was the distance, the length of the curve. And so remember at Hicks, this Hawaii conference 4 years ago, the CEO of PJM was bragging about how there's auctions for the price per mile, and it was going to zero. So we got your batteries, And so the thing is that the batteries won't be fooled twice, It's a zero marginal cost product. They spent all this money getting the batteries in, thinking they'd get paid mileage, and then it went to zero. And all these things we're talking, a lot of these things we're talking about are zero marginal costs. And the same thing can happen, I mean, they'll all be excited that things will be happening, and then wham, it'll just disappear. So I don't understand the mindset in the power area. So if this was any other field of engineering, it would be a control question, and we would talk about contracts for services. I want an aileron company to supply me with ailerons, and I'd pay them every year for doing that. So it's illegal to talk about contracts in the power domain. And I don't know why. It has to be high frequency trading.
No, I mean,
No, we're not, but it is verboten. I mean, you can't talk about long-term contracts.
what is a power purchase agreement? I will sell
I'm
you.
not talking about the academic community. I'm not talking about, in real life it's done.
But if in real life it's working, then in the academic life it isn't working, and that's pretty good, I think.
I'm talking about the range of discussion. So when people talk about the future, it always boils to, there's these exciting control problems, and then the control gets mixed up with the markets. It always becomes high-frequency trading. And I don't know of any example where it's really been of value, the high-frequency trading. Anyway, that's just a, and there's so much empirical evidence that causes problems.
I think we'd have to have a longer,
Yeah.
it's at 5 o'clock, I'm sure. All of you have kids to children to pick up and wives to feed. Thank you.